And if you go down and take some time to see it, I mean, you walk down in our sterile processing and we're a couple hundred trays behind, perhaps, and it's chaos down there. And you have pulled clinical people from the OR to come down and help run through and get things back on track. You really quickly understand that this is a very, very complex problem.
From the basement to the boardroom, from ideas to innovation, you're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are pushing the sterile processing industry forward. Each week, you'll encounter diverse perspectives from subject matter experts across the country and around the globe. Frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you are tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. Now, turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
All right, Hank. Today we are going to be talking to Dr. Martin Knowles on this entire season, dedicated to the voice of surgeons and speaking really to the sterile processing audience, giving them perspective, but also tips and just really practical advice about how to engage surgeons, because ultimately collaborating together is what's going to move this industry forward. And how can we do that? Well, we've talked a lot about instrument data, and Dr. Knowles is going to give us his take on how to get that data, how to get it right, and then how to use it to bridge gaps in communication and do a better job of collaborating.
That's right, Justin. Without data, it's just kind of our opinion on what we think the inventory should be, on what we think quality should be, on what we think on-time start times are. But with the data in view, that's a bridge. That's the intersection that can bring not only sterile processing and the surgeon together, but the whole perioperative workflow. So I'm really excited to talk to Dr. Knowles today about that piece and the gaps he sees, the opportunities he sees, and what's coming down the line.
All right, stay with us. We're going to be right back with Dr. Martin Knowles. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
We are speaking with Dr. Martin Knowles. He's the chair of surgery and a vascular surgeon at UNC Rex in Raleigh, North Carolina. And this is not your first appearance, Dr. Knowles, because you're also the founder and CMO at Opflow. And we have a podcast, a vendor spotlight, going back almost 3 years now, highlighting some of the values. So I think we're due for another spotlight interview so we can get an update 3 years later. But obviously we brought you on today to talk a lot more about your experience as a surgeon and really connecting that and bringing that perspective to our audience in sterile processing. So thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, it's great to be here. It's great to be back. And this is something that I have a great passion for. So part of the reason that we started Opflow, so excited to talk through all of these points that we're going to talk through today. So again, very excited to be here.
You know, before we got on, you were talking about, all the different perspectives that you have, obviously being in business, but also still being a direct care provider and all of the interactions that you've had. Can you detail that for us? Because I know it's going to play out a lot in our conversations today.
Yeah, I am about 9-10 years out in practice now. I started off in Texas. I've been in North Carolina now for about 8 years, and busy clinical vascular surgeon, do a little bit of everything. So, busy vascular practice. We have 8 surgeons. We have 2 other providers in our group. So a big group. We run typically 2 to 3 rooms a day. So busy vascular service as it comes from if you think about it in the scale of a lot of hospitals around the country. And so, obviously seeing the ins and outs of very busy clinical practice and what that means and how things work in the operating room. On the other side, as you mentioned, Chief Medical Officer for Opflow, which is a company that really came out of some frustrations in the operating room and seeing inefficiencies and how things could maybe be run better, and work towards finding cost savings, efficiencies, making things work much, much better in the operating room, because we really are stuck in the sort of 70s in a lot of ways with what we do and how we do things, not just in the operating room itself, but in really the whole perioperative space. And so that part. And then, I have administrative roles in the hospital, part of lots of committees as it relates to the operating room, efficiency committee, safety committee, block committees, everything related to how do we take something that is just pure energy exerting in every direction, which is trying to get things working in an operating room, and ball it together and make it move in one direction rather than Brownian motion and it going in every direction and scattering. So, a lot of this stuff, there's interplay between them, and then there's a lot that are just out in an island. But really, I think that there's a lot of corollaries between all those different things and how you can be successful. And I think it's navigating those common core points as we we can talk about those.
Yeah, you talked about being in the 70s, and that's not an uncommon conversation in healthcare, right? I've heard that conversation so many times, and it doesn't matter if I'm talking about the operating room or supply chain or sterile processing. We hear that a great deal, and it always highlights the need for technologies. But a lot of times the kind of technology that we see coming to the table is very focused on devices, which is exactly where those advancements have happened since the 70s. But what you're talking about is operational efficiencies and the kinds of technology that can take all of this potential data and actually do something with it. And so as we talk about data, I would just kind of position this back to you and say, from the surgeon perspective and really drilling down on instrumentation, what kind of data is standard practice out there? What standard information do you get about instruments as a surgeon?
So if I take off my chair hat and just be a regular surgeon, I would tell you that I get no information, no data. I get nothing. I know a couple things. I know, did my case start on time? And if it didn't, why did it not start on time? And I maybe hear, hey, there was a backlog of trays, or hey, we had to flash something, or, a small snip of information. But really, we don't get much information, and we don't know what's happening there. There's a giant disconnect between what's happening in the room and what the surgeon is typically aware of, and what's actually happening underneath, and what's happening generally a floor below, which is what happens in sterile processing to make that case, A, run on time, B, have the equipment that's needed, and that is from a QA process is quality, it's clean, it's sterilized appropriately, it's, you're following IFU. There's so many of those things that surgeons just take for granted. And honestly, it's just I don't have what I need the second I ask for it. That's really frustrating, and not understanding what all goes into that, and how much equipment is down there, and how many trays are down there, and how much is moving through a busy operating room and surgical services in a day-to-day basis. So the answer is very, very, very little. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with this, is that there's a disconnect and a true lack of understanding between the two sides, the clinical side even, and some of the clinical team, not just the surgeon, but the clinical team, and what's happening in sterile processing, and that interplay between. And there's some people that walk a role between both, Clin 4s or the service coordinators, that kind of touch on both. But those are you've got one person for 3 or 4 services walking that line. It's very uncommon to get very detailed information as to what's happening and why things are maybe not working as well as they should.
So what's interesting to me about that is we've had a lot of conversations, and I would say it's even just as simple as inventory, like volumes, inventory, what is actually there, and then volumes, how much needs to be used. And that's a very basic operational kind of concept, but I feel like that is not there. I'm going to ask you this follow-up question, and it's 2 parts. And the first one is, what information do you think surgeons like today, if we approached just any surgeon from any service, just real blanket kind of generic answer. If you ask them what information would you like to know about your instruments, what would their answer be? And I have to ask it that way because you've already drilled in deep enough here to give me another answer, which may not be congruent with your first answer, which would be what information should they have and what do they need that maybe they don't even know they need?
I would answer, and I'm not trying to speak for an entire population of surgeons, but I will tell you, vast majority of surgeons want the bare minimum that gets them to start their case on time and finish their case safely. And that's really it. There's not a lot of understanding behind it. We see so much of we're having issues with getting trays finished and having a backlog of trays. And the answer being, you know what? They don't have my trays ready. We should buy more inventory. We should have more trays. The answer to it not being ready is just to make it even worse. And it becomes this just catch-22 of, well, those trays weren't sterilized and ready on time. The issue must be that we don't have enough. So if we get more inventory, never mind the capital expense, never mind space issues and throughput issues, we're just going to do that because that's going to fix the problem. And that for an individual or for an individual service line maybe fixes it for a very short period of time. But it compounds that issue even further down the road and doesn't actually fix the problem. So the issue is, what data should we know or should we get is really, I think, a multitude. I think we should know what trays are on our pick list, on our preference card. We should know what is generally available for the case, what's open for the case. And, really where I live is I think I should know what instruments in the individual trays are actually used and which ones aren't used. And, we can talk a little bit more about that maybe when we get to standardization, if we touch on that. But, I think knowing what's used, what's not used, when it's used, what things are shared between service lines, if I don't have trays available to me, maybe it's because orthopedics are taking all of these trays because they like certain things out of it that we use as well. You have to have a greater understanding. And we live in these silos where I just see things magically pop up in the room and the table's open and this magical blue aura of sterile instruments across the table. And I get to do, what I do. But, you have to have a greater understanding of what's actually happening. And maybe it gives you a better idea of why it doesn't work or why issues arise. Knowing how often the trays are sterilized on a yearly basis, how many copies of those trays we have, maybe help you understand, what issues you might have with getting them sterilized and back on. Our hospital for a long time actually sent out trays to an offsite re-sterilization system to then have them come back. So we had a higher inventory of trays to allow for transportation of trays to an offsite facility and then back. And so you have to understand a fair amount of data around what's happening with those trays to even have an understanding of why it works or why it doesn't work. And then on top of that, what issues are we having? Is there damage to instruments? Is there issue with cohabitation of very fine instruments with bigger, bulkier instruments, and you're damaging fine Castro Viejos that are, $1,200, $1,500 a pop. And you wonder, maybe more, and wondering why you're having issues with them. There's so much that goes into it. And I think, unfortunately, there's not a feedback loop from the surgeon to sterile processing and back to make it work. And one of the things that we've done at Rex is to make sure, to that point, that in our leader, we have a surgical executive committee where leaders talk about everything related to what's happening in the OR. And then lots of subcommittees that talk through block, safety, efficiency, and sterile processing is a big part of that. But you have to have members and representatives from the sterile processing side actually present and able to discuss those issues at a leadership level to actually have people understand why things are working and why they aren't. And I think that's the big issue. So big difference between what do you think surgeons want, which is probably most of them would say not anything, to what should they know, which is the laundry list of things I just gave you, which I think gives you a better understanding of why things work or why they don't work.
Yeah, at the end of the day, they just want to have what they need when they need it. ready to go, every case, every time. And if they don't need to know any of the data, then there's just like leave the data out. It's just like an airplane pilot, right? Like he doesn't need to know everything about the plane. He just needs to know when he hits the button and pulls up and pushes down, it's going to do it at the time that he needs it. And then when it doesn't, that's when the questions come up, to your point on why is this not going on? And you begin drilling down. And I want to go back, to what you said about the 1970s. For some of us, like myself, I wasn't around in the 1970s. Justin was around for the majority of the 1970s. But what's interesting is, like I kind of hear 1970s, I think, oh yeah, 30 years ago. Well, that's like 50 years ago now. And you're telling us that all of these kind of data questions, right? They're going back 5 decades at the speed now, like Justin mentioned. All this other innovation is going on at the medical device level, and then sterile processing. We're kind of meeting in the middle. I'll say we're not in the 1970s anymore, but we're probably late 80s, early 90s. We still got some catching up to do as well. And it brings me, I guess, to my question, which is in the breakdown of the data that you're kind of describing for like what the surgeons need to know, what they want to know, what they should know. I also add in what you brought up is that magical answer of, hey, just buy more instruments. That's not flying the way that it was, 5-10 years ago. And so now there's a question of, well, how do we balance the desires of our surgeons, the preferences of our surgeons, and our ability on the sterile processing side or the operator room side to gather all that data and to synthesize it in a way that it makes sense? What are your insights on that part?
Well, I think it's a perfect storm of things. I think the complexity of cases has increased. And with that, I think the need for the amount of instrumentation and the complexity of the instrumentation and what it takes to re-sterilize it has increased. I saw a statistic that said that really over like a 10-year period, the number of trays present for cases has gone up almost 30%. I mean, I think we're all seeing that, right? And so you're doing the same number of cases, you're having 30% more inventory coming through. Well, I talk to a lot of sterile processing departments in a lot of hospitals. I don't hear that they're getting 30% more resources or 30% more personnel.
Nothing.
Right? Or that they're getting space for 30% more equipment coming through. That's one, very, very difficult part with it. I think the other part is, hospitals are working these days on razor thin margins. And this whole we can do whatever because we're making money and it works. And, honestly, I don't know what happens down there. And we hear that a lot from administrators. I don't really know what happens down there. Surgery happens because of what they do down there, but nobody really knows.
It's
That's
magic.
not really flying anymore. Yeah, it's magic. But, now it's not flying anymore. And now they're looking into, why is the repurchase cost so high every year on instrumentation? Why is the repair cost so high? Why are we losing so many people in sterile processing? Why is it a revolving door? And not understanding that you can't have people safely, most importantly, safely and by IFU working through these trays and getting them ready for surgery, at a quality that I always say a quality that you would want those trays used on one of your family members, right? I mean, this is a very serious, very, very important thing that people do. And so you've got this collision of all of these issues all hitting. And at the top of it, it has percolated to where the surgeons don't get to write their own ticket anymore. It's gone are the days of Dr. X asked for this, so we just, yes, of course, we're going to do that for you. That's not happening anymore. And I think to your earlier point, the whole, I don't care how you do it, I just need everything there. Well, the hospitals are starting to push back and say, okay, so you asked for this one instrument one time. If you need that, how often do you need that instrument or that peel pack item for it to make financial sense, for it to be available for every single case in the off chance that you need it? Is it 1 out of 3? Is it 1 out of 5? Is it 1 out of 10? Is it 1 out of 50? Is it 1 out of 100? And so people they're honing in on that and saying, well, is it worth adding inventory for the one-off chance, the 1 in 100 chance that you need that instrument on that tray? We're already at the weight limit. We're going to be over the weight limit. There's a million issues that can potentially happen. At what point do we push back?
What is that tipping point, if you will, for the data then that the surgeons need to operate in a way that serves sterile processing? This whole season is about how sterile processing can better serve the surgeons, but I'm kind of curious, like to your point about if they knew more about what's going on in sterile processing and that needs to go on to get that inventory to them, and all those contributing factors that you mentioned about the repair time, the downtime, the repurchasing costs, the lost instruments, like all of that, like what kind of data, what more data would they need to actually make decisions that actually it's going to impact sterile processing, but it's also going to positively impact them on the other side because it's that whole circular motion.
Yeah, it's very tough. And, I don't know, let me put it this way. I think that the answer is that I think gone are the times where we just have to accept that things are the way they are. And I think that I always encourage surgeons to go down and walk through sterile processing and walk through a tray coming down from the room and go through the process to actually understand part of it. Because a lot of us don't understand. A lot of us don't take the time to understand. And so there's these frustrations and this lack of understanding of why things maybe don't work the way they should. And if you go down and take some time to see it, you walk down in our sterile processing and we're a couple hundred trays behind, perhaps, and it's chaos down there. And you have pulled clinical people from the OR to come down and help run through and get things back on track. You really quickly understand that this is a very, very complex problem. So I 100% agree with you. This should not be how, like in your words, how does sterile processing better serve the surgeons? This is a bidirectional relationship. It's not a unidirectional thing. We have to understand things. And I think that the answer is flexibility. To just be blunt, we have to, there are many times where I ask for something. Does it matter if it's a right angle that I ask for? And I say, hey, I want the short right angle. And they say, that one fell on the floor. Is my life really, really, really going to be that much different if I use the longer one? No, probably not. Now, there are certain cases where you need exactly what you need in certain scenarios. But a lot of the time that we're asking for things, other things that are already there suffice just fine. And I think flexibility is probably the answer that I would say. Now, the problem is a lot of hospitals are moving towards the standardization angle to try and answer this question. And I think that is probably okay to a certain point, but not something that exactly gets surgeons excited behind the scenes, because we all think we do things very differently. And we think that we're very special. And one of the great things about my company is that we found that we're not, and that we all generally have the same usage. We do the same things wherever we are in the country. So again, long-winded answer, but I think the answer for us to better serve SPD is flexibility.
All right. So let's bring this down to something really concrete for the audience too, which would be practical takeaways. Cause I definitely agree with you about it's bidirectional. It requires flexibility. It requires flexibility on both sides. One interview that we've done this season is on orthopedic trauma, right? And in that trauma setting, you have to be flexible. There's no way to predict what's going to happen from one day to another. And so, I think everybody in healthcare to an extent is flexible, but I think that's where the redundancy is created from. It's to allow for flexibility. And so a lot of times people feel like, I'm going to lose my flexibility with that standardization effort, or you're going to take something away from me that I absolutely need. And so, bringing this back to something that's practical and really practical for sterile processing, right? To take what you're saying, because that's kind of the whole point is, we want to encourage people to that they have expertise in sterile processing to be able to speak with their counterparts and their colleagues in surgical services. But it would be very hard for anybody to approach a surgeon, especially how pressed you can be for time in the middle of that operation, or, if there is an issue and they have a chance to talk with you, to really make sure that they're talking your language And I think that's where your insight is so valuable in the conversations today. But, what are two practical takeaways that somebody in sterile processing, they could be a frontline tech, they could be a manager at any level, that they could then use to build these better relationships and really leverage the instrument data that we already talked about, many of you not having, but they maybe have some insight on? How could they bridge that gap and start to talk a common language that would really have a good, solid impact on the surgeon's day to day?
Yeah. I think number one is something I mentioned earlier, is that, we can't work in silos. We can't have all these surgeon leadership meetings and talk about efficiency and how things are working and leave out something like sterile processing. And it's routinely done in the hospitals that I've been, where it just doesn't get discussed. It's an expectation without any real, communication to make it actually any better. So, I would say a takeaway would be involve your SPD leadership and the people that really have boots on the ground into some of those meetings, into your efficiency meetings and your safety meetings and your overall leadership meetings, to be able to answer questions and have those conversations with the surgeons. We found early on that it prompted the other part, which is inviting the surgeons down to see these parts of things and understand why things maybe are the way that they are. That you can't just, it sounds easy to say, well, why don't we sterilize that tray real quick? But going down there and seeing that, there's the 200 trays that are ready to go through right now. And by the way, there's about, 5 vendors standing in line trying to push through their trays to get their case done, right? And everything else that goes into that. So an understanding. So I think, involvement in a higher level set of discussions, I think, inviting surgeons and being open and communicating with the surgeons. And I think that has two parts. Invite the surgeons down to come look. But also, if you're SPD, personnel, and you're a leader down there, don't go up and talk to the surgeon in the room and have conversations. I think it's equally as important for us to go down and see SPD as it is for sterile processing leaders and personnel to go up to the room and see what we're frustrated about and see what we are having issues with and to understand it from our side. And I think that communication and that openness is a big takeaway, because otherwise it continues to just be this thing that's over there. I think it's over on the first floor somewhere over there. I don't even know what happens. We've got to get away from that. And I think that those would be my two takeaways. I'm going to give you a third because I think this one's really important, which is I think you have to have very strong service coordinators or CLIN4s, whatever the terminology that you use, that glue that bridges between the clinical side and SPD. And I think the stronger those people are, the better the communication is and the understanding of what's needed. They know what's used on trays, not used on trays, needed for certain surgeons, what the issues in SPD that can help that they're really, really in my opinion, probably the most important people in surgical services.
So Hank, we did an episode on that last point, and was it with Bobby? Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah,
talking about OR liaisons.
Yeah. So I really like, that function, because it's not just communication, it's consistent, fluid communication throughout every day. That's a big part of the magic of that. You also talked about bringing, sterile processing to the table with those meetings with the surgeons, because I think one of the other things that winds up being a breakdown is the surgeon's experience ends up getting passed through a game of telephone from their surgical tech to somebody else who eventually talks to sterile processing. And you also don't have a direct line. And I don't know that you really get a direct line out of the liaison either. But I think that there's sometimes feedback that never hits sterile processing because there isn't that conduit. So they're blinded to it. So it's just compounded by the lack of regular communication, but still having that opportunity to sit away from the day-to-day operation and hear from the surgeons and the things that is at least perceived by the surgeon to be an ongoing issue. You may find somebody from SPD says, oh, that's an easy answer. But what we needed was collaboration from you and your team. And this is how we can help you, but you've got to come to the table with us. And when things flying around and everything's going crazy and you've got add-ons, that's not the right time to talk about that stuff. and it won't ever stick.
And that's where those other meetings are helpful. And I think part of it is, documentation of issues as it relates to instrumentation or delays or anything else, so that they could get brought up, that they can get talked about, as you mentioned, at a time that's not the heat of the moment when everyone, you have that issue. You're the surgeon in the room. You're frustrated because there's not a tray available. I understand that some of us can be a little heated in those moments, but talking about it after the fact and looking through to figure out exactly what was the issue that led to that point, because it's never one issue. It's generally we had a call out down in SPD, so we're running behind. There was 3 add-ons. This never happens, but we had, 4 of the same type of case, and we only have 5 of those trays. So it was really hard to get them turned around, and we don't know where the 5th one is. All of those things you find, you go, well, wait, how often do we do 4 of those cases in a row? And you can pull that data.
I love that. This never happens, but it actually does happen. But we don't understand it doesn't happen regularly. It doesn't happen weekly, but typically those things do happen. And when we say that kind of, it never happens, what we mean is it doesn't happen often, but we're not really diving into the why does it happen and how can we be ready for it? Because even one aggravating day, back to that communication back and forth, one aggravating day can do a lot of damage to the relationship that you're trying to foster. And, you could feel like everything's great for 3 weeks, and then that day comes again and everybody moves into this old position of, well, that's just what they do. And it doesn't matter what side you're on. That's just what they do. And then all of a sudden that wall starts, building back up and breaking down the culture. So Dr. Knowles, phenomenal interview. And I do want to kind of point everybody back. I did mention that we did a vendor spotlight with you several years ago. All you have to do is download the Beyond Clean app and look up OpFlow. That's OPFLOW. And you can listen to Dr. Knowles' first appearance on Beyond Clean. And so an even better job here on the second appearance. I don't know, great job both times, but really, really loved having you back on, especially for this very special season of Beyond Clean.
Perfect. Well, thank you for the invitation. It was wonderful to chat through this stuff. I think we fixed everything today. So I look forward to everybody everywhere doing so much better. But, I think it's really important stuff. And I think it's the future. It's going to have to be what we're talking about. Otherwise, hospitals are going to get left behind. They're going to have significant issues. So, I think it's the next step.
That was Dr. Martin Knowles, Chair of Surgery and a Vascular Surgeon at UNC Rex in Raleigh, North Carolina. And Hank, the data thing is just never going to go away. It's going to be a conversation that we're going to have until you and I finally hang up our microphones. It's needed, but we're still talking about baseline information. And this conversation just continues to reiterate or hammer home a very simple theme through the season, is that the surgeons don't have a lot, if any, information about their instrumentation. And so, it can be as simple as what we've talked about at the very beginning and have talked with others about the volume of sets, the volume of instrumentation, how much goes through. But the folks in sterile processing 100% know how many sets and if there's enough inventory. And the counter to that, if there's too much inventory in a set and that's overloaded. And I just think we really, to be evidence-based, which is how things move in healthcare, we have to continue to gather that information. We have to scrub that information. We have to make it clean. And then we need to get a seat at the table to present that information in an organized way.
Yeah. That make it clean part, that was kind of the unspoken undercurrent of our conversation. The data that we do have many times is so dirty, it's unusable. Going back to the sterile processing side, we know how dirty your account sheets are, how incomplete they are, how the names are wrong, how the product numbers are incomplete or incorrect many times, how there's different names, and on and on and on. And that's just our own count sheets, not even entering into the preference card conversation and all that data. And then to hear Dr. Knowles say, the average surgeon doesn't have any data on the inventory. That was kind of a little shocking to me, but that's clearly a problem. Like, that's the first check mark to say, hey, how are you going to know if we're doing a good job besides just your experience with the instruments if you don't have data in front of you? So I think that's a call out and challenge, to innovators, department leaders out there to start getting whatever data you can as clean as possible in the hands of your surgeons as quick as possible so that this real collaborative communication can begin.
Yeah. All right, Hank. Well, that does it for this show, but this really has been a great season. Why don't you tell everybody the best way to listen to the Beyond Clean podcast?
Well, Justin, the best way to listen is obviously through the Beyond Clean mobile app, available on Apple, which I choose, or Android, which, other people like Justin will choose. But, download the mobile app. And
Hold on. The fact that it's available on iTunes and Apple is hilarious because if anybody wants a little behind the scenes, this is the central argument that consistently happens in our organization. I'm a PC guy. He's a Mac guy. And, so
I'm going to offend people.
We're battling all the time on this.
It's basically the young, cool, hip people like me are Apple and, everybody else is Android. No, I'm just kidding.
All the businessmen.
That's the best way to listen to the show, Justin, or anywhere podcasts are found if you're one of the Stitcher, the iHeart Radio, et cetera, et cetera. If you've got any ideas for a guest for the show, topic for the show, we'd love to hear them. You can reach out to us on LinkedIn. That's actually the best way to get an interview on Beyond Clean is be active on LinkedIn.
Because everybody knows Hank doesn't answer his emails. If you want to talk to Hank, you got to reach out to him in LinkedIn.
Yes. Once, twice, 3 times a lady, as I think Tom Jones might have said. But besides that, please leave us a rating and review. Those do matter. They impact people who are downloading the app for the first time or thinking about it. And they're like, man, 100 million people have rated this 5 stars. They must be doing something right over there on Beyond Clean. That's going to do it for this episode. Thanks for listening, guys. And as we say around here, keep fighting dirty.